Hi, everybody. So today I want to talk about what I promised I would talk about last week, and that is factors that can come into play with regards to learning, behavior, even dyslexia when a child has this reflex retained. So just to quickly recap on what are retained primitive reflexes, they are basically reflexes that should be present when your child is an infant. They help them with survival, but then they should integrate into the nervous system, and movement, early infant motor movement, helps to do that. However, if your child, for various reasons, which I've talked about in the past, these reflexes still are present, so they are retained, then what happens is it will cause all kinds of barriers for them to access their higher cortex, and it will result in all kinds of breakdown with learning, behavior, and cognition, and so forth. So what I want to talk about today is one of the reflexes that is linked to fear, anxiety, extreme shyness, selective mutism, all kinds of really intense type behaviors that we can see in children. And I want to talk about it because so often when our kids have these struggles unfortunately for the parents, professionals often defer to, okay, there must have been a trauma, especially if like a child's not speaking or extremely shy or has just obsessive anxieties. This pertains, by the way, to OCD as well. The professionals often will defer to thinking there's been some kind of trauma. And if that is ruled out, then often we assume it's something to do with personality, or we think it's, just a biochemical imbalance. And I was really shocked to learn about this when I first started learning about this several years ago. And I was even more shocked when I actually started seeing the results of what can happen. Not only just seeing, okay, they have clear signs of what is called a retained fear paralysis reflex, but when we started working on it and how that improved. So, I just to give you another example, a client of mine, we'll call her Dana. She was about 7 or 8 years old, extremely shy. So I'm not talking a little bit socially awkward. I'm talking like just goes into full on freeze mode when someone addresses her, hardly speaks, does not really speak in class, doesn't have a lot of friends, obviously, because she's just not able to really relax and be herself. Very fearful, whether it was going to a birthday party, going somewhere even for Christmas time, always telling mom, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. Just constant worrying, which in an adult we would say like it's negative, right? If they were constantly, no matter what's going on, thinking of what's going to go wrong. Mom didn't know what to do because her and her husband were both fairly upbeat people. They, of course, totally blame themselves for, this happening with their child and so forth. And it was assumed that Dana had an anxiety disorder. They said, it's genetic, it's just an anxiety disorder. Your daughter might have to go on medication. They didn't want to go that route. And anyway, then they started working with me. They came across me through my website, and one of the things that was very, very clear right away is that she had a retained fear paralysis reflex. And once we started working on that, and of course, all the other stuff that we do with nutrition and other brain exercises and so forth, Dana made amazing gains. She was no longer so negative, so fearful, more social, didn't just freeze up. So let me get in a little bit into talking about what is the fear paralysis reflex, because it's so, to me, it's mind-blowing that we always look at chemical imbalances or we assume it's trauma or situational, and there's this whole other factor that could be there. And I'm not saying it's always a factor. Sometimes there's other reasons why kids are responding this way. But in this particular case, the fear paralysis reflex will cause or contribute to lifelong issues with fear, anxiety, depression, just negative thinking, all of that type of stuff, if that reflex is present. So what basically happens is that if it is retained, the child or person's system just goes into a paralysis, hence the term fear paralysis reflex, that is well beyond logic over situations that just, the reaction does not match the situation. And you might be wondering, like, why would nature do this? Like, why would this reflex even exist in the first place? So I won't go too far into it, but just to give you a tiny bit of background information, this reflex should actually be integrated and disappear before the child is even born. It integrates well into pregnancy. So what it is it's a reflex that's there in case mom is in an extreme stressful state, needs to get away, right? Saber-toothed tiger is chasing her, whatever the case may be. And the baby kind of goes, or the fetus kind of goes into a restrictive withdrawal state and stops taking resources from mom and just goes inward to basically decrease the amount of resources it's drawing from mom to allow mom to escape the danger. So in terms of like survival, in terms of in utero, very, very important. But you can see this is not the reflex this is not what we want, or a good reaction we want in any situation. And in most cases, not even in danger situations, freezing is not really the response that we want. So you've probably heard of fight or flight, and more commonly now, finally, we're hearing about freeze. This is the freeze mode that they go into. So it activates the freeze response. Sometimes we call it the fawn response, and sometimes kids, it doesn't always mean they totally freeze. And so I won't get into it too much today, but there is a situation where kids, and I see it more with boys, where they have the fear paralysis reflex and they get really aggressive. It's almost like they're freezing in a kind of in a stuck kind of way, but I'm not going to go down that path because that's a whole other situation. But basically it causes us to mostly withdraw from the situation, to shut down, to isolate, and so forth. And so why I want to mention the fawn response, which is connected to the freeze response, is if you think of like, a really sweet little bunny rabbit or baby deer, right? The fawn response is when kids are like overly nice and just they encounter any kind of situation they perceive as dangerous, and they feel the way to react is to withdraw, so maybe not standing up for themselves and just be like, okay, whatever. So that's an example of the fawn response. And in most situations, it's not the most healthy response, and it's not really going to get us too far. So these kids tend to be shy, typically extremely shy, to the point of like, if they're asked something, they might just be unable to respond. And you might even see physical signs like extreme blushing and so forth. Withdrawing, hard time engaging confidently in just everyday activities because they're just always on some level in this state. So in healthy development, the fear paralysis reflex will integrate and actually become what is called the Morrow Reflex, which I'm going to talk more about next week. So I'm not going to get into that. All I will say is that if this fear paralysis reflex is retained, it actually prevents the integration as well of the Morrow Reflex, and the Morrow Reflex is connected to fight or flight. So if you have a kid who's really angry, aggressive, super anxious, any of that, it could be connected to because they have a unintegrated or a retained Morrow as well as fear paralysis reflex, but I will get more into that next week. Why the fear paralysis reflex is also important to acknowledge is because it can also create a lot of other issues, because it can prevent the integration of a whole lot of other reflexes, because it really lays the groundwork for other primitive reflexes. And as if you've been following me for a while, you know that if one reflex is not integrated, it can cause just a whole lot of problems. And obviously the more that are retained, the more difficulties with learning, reading, behavior, all of that type of stuff is going to happen. So the other thing that was found with the research that's been done on this is that and this pertains, by the way, not just to the fear paralysis reflex, but many of them, that the more present the primitive reflex, the more serious and disruptive the the reflex will be to the child's learning, to their behavior, to their ability to relax, to their ability to stay calm and just navigate through life in a way that can help them, learn and develop optimally. So you might be wondering at this point, what are some potential causes of this? Again, No mama guilt, but there is certain things, right, that can cause this reflex to not disappear, integrate in utero. And that could be things like mom's under a lot of stress during pregnancy. It could be mom's faced a trauma. It could even be a physical trauma, not necessarily an emotional one. Premature birth, C-section have been identified as contributing factors, as well as things like exposure to heavy metals, toxins, chemicals, all that type of stuff that we hear about so often. And also, again, just going back to mom's mental health. So maybe mom wasn't under a lot of stress during pregnancy, but maybe mom just in general has a lot of cortisol and is under a lot of stress because she has an anxiety disorder herself or some other mental health issue. So those are causes, but who cares? Because you know what? Regardless, we can integrate that reflex. It is not too late just because it's active. It's not too late to integrate it so that our children can function and just be happier, calmer kids. So you might be wondering at this point, what are some symptoms of an active fear paralysis reflex? So some of the common symptoms with kids that have the fear paralysis reflex are things like extreme shyness or exaggerated embarrassment, low tolerance to stress, just not, maybe even as teenagers, they just aren't very resilient. Obviously, anxiety, depression, negative thinking, phobias. A lot of these kids, when they're younger, have issues with night terrors. Poor eye contact. We see this reflex being active quite a bit, by the way, in autism spectrum children. Hypersensitivity to in terms of senses. So again, connected to ASD, just overload of the sensory system with visual, tactile stimulation, all of that type of stuff. And just really constantly, I don't want to say constantly, but just easily goes into like a frozen state of fear. Just can't seem to snap out of it sometimes and so forth. So you might see, as I mentioned, I said I would touch on, you might see defiance or like things like breath holding, because it's not always like when I think of the fear paralysis reflex, admittedly, the first thing that comes to mind is like, a 6-year-old girl who's super shy, has elective mutism, and is just, really withdrawn, but it doesn't always look like that. And it can look like a kid who's actually reacts because of the fear and so forth. So panic disorder is very common when the fear paralysis reflex is active, as well as just general reluctance to try new activities or engage in things that other kids want to do or other people want to do, because there's just this constant fear. And they know, right? As they get older, they know their body and know, like, I just freeze up. And you might even know, maybe you're like this. Maybe you know an adult like this who says, I feel like such a moron. I just freeze up and I can't get over it and so forth. And to be clear, there's a lot of reasons why that can happen. I mean, PTSD can do that as well, right? But this fear paralysis reflex can be a big factor in this. And by the way, if someone has faced a trauma, these reflexes can become unintegrated. Even if they one time, they develop properly and everything was fine, they can reappear. So reluctance to try new activities, I mentioned that. And just separation anxiety is really common, as well as OCD. And again, that's just like, trying to control our sense of anxiety or our feelings of vulnerability by controlling and having these rituals and so forth. That's so common with OCD. So to test to see if the fear paralysis reflex is active in your child, it is like super simple, probably one of the simplest exercises. There is another one that can be done. I'm not going to go through it today. It's a little more tricky, but this one is really simple and it's less likely to activate your child. The other one can trigger your child, so I really don't want people just doing this at home. So you're going to have your child stand barefoot. Barefoot is important in an area where there's like room to walk around, like a hallway or something. And you're going to have them walk in a straight line. So pretty simple, right? But what you're going to do is you're going to watch for certain things. Obviously, you're not going to tell them what you're looking for. Just tell them you're just checking something. And you're going to look for things like when they are walking, they have poor eye contact. Look at their toes. Do their toes curl or twitch? Does their body appear more tense? Do they seem to be holding their breath when they're walking? Does it not appear to be a relaxed posture or a relaxed state? They stare. They are making eye contact, but they are not blinking. They tighten their hands. Maybe they're making fists, or their fingers are twitching. Again, just look for all those subtle details, and obviously you know your child best. Or might even sway as he or she walks that, down the hallway or that line or whatever. So you want to watch for those. Give it a shot. Let me know in the comments below how it goes, whether you're watching the live or the replay. I'm always curious to hear this. I had people with the test that I suggested, or the screening I suggested last week, message me back, and it was great to hear the different results. So let me know what you're seeing. Do keep in mind, this is not a hard and fast test in terms of yes or no. It's a guide. And I really like to go on symptoms as well. So if they're showing all of this, then that might be a good reason to say, okay, we probably need to exercise, to do exercises to integrate the fear paralysis reflex. And like I said, there is another assessment we can do, but I don't want to just have everyone do it just because it can trigger some kids and so forth. And I don't want to be responsible for kids being triggered when we can't bring them back into a state of calm and so forth. So let me know in the comments below what you are seeing. And if you haven't already grabbed my free starter kit, the Laser Focus Learner, you can grab that. I'll pop the link to that in the comments below. Thanks for watching, everybody. And next week, I will be talking about the Morrow Reflex and how that is related to fight or flight, and how that reflex, when we started integrating that with one particular client, all of a sudden her son was not fighting her on homework anymore. He was sitting down, getting his work done 5 days in 1 week, no problems. So thanks for watching. Until next time.